Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining the session, which is going to be all about weaponizing your story, a technique and a tactic taken directly from pirates. But there's a few different reasons that I wanted to run the session today. And the first is really all about why we would need our message to stand out and grab people's attention. Why would you need to weaponize your story? And I think that the stat that really has stood out to me in everything I've read is that we each see somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 commercial messages each day. I pinched that stat from John Alexander at the New Citizenship Project. And he talked about that in a talk, which was actually quite a few years ago now. So I imagine that number's gone up. But essentially, it's hard to get people to pay attention, even when there are really huge budgets behind it. So we have to work twice as hard. The second reason is really because Flatpak isn't just about changing political culture in the sense of moving away from the two-party system. It's also about transforming political culture in making it more fun and much less dull and dry. So I think that having big, bold, brave campaigns is part of that transformation. And the third reason is that it's more of a personal one. Before I ran Be More Pirate, I worked as a communications manager. So I'm really, I feel very strongly about good communication. And I work with lots of different social entrepreneurs or people running socially driven projects, purpose-driven projects. And I would often find that they were so focused on doing what they did, delivering their work, and all the intricacies of that they wouldn't really spend too much time thinking about the story of it and how they were going to tell that to people in a way that really convinced them and got them on board with the idea. And so that would almost be like an afterthought. And it was a big oversight because they really missed moments when they could be converting people and getting them on board. So I'm going to take a little bit of what I learned through doing that, and then also drawing on the pirate story. So yeah, the pirates really were the PR masters of their fate. They are probably, well, we quite often think of Coca-Cola as the world's first brand, but I always argue that it was in fact the Jolly Roger, the skull and crossbones. When you saw it on the horizon as an ordinary sailor, you would know to keep well back, or the message that came with it was surrender or die, one of the world's most effective taglines, I think. So, and pirates did this quite deliberately. They really didn't want to get into battle, despite what you might think. They raised the black, raised the Jolly Roger as a way of actually preserving their resources. It was far easier to ask people to immediately surrender than to get into a big old fight. So it was a strategic decision, and they would created lots and lots of drama around who the pirates were, a lot of which wasn't actually true, to right down to the kind of variation in the Jolly Rogers. So it was almost always white on black. It was a very distinctive brand, but they would use different variations on skeletons, and they would sometimes use hourglasses to signal that your time's running out, all kinds of threatening messages. But what I'm going to cover today is sort of distill the pirate strategies down into three key messages of how exactly to weaponize the story. The three things that are kind of the most important to take on board if you're devising a campaign. And the first one is really to make the message singular and unignorable. I mean, that's what they were doing with the Jolly Roger. But I'd distill that down even more. Making it singular and unignorable is really about simplicity, specificity, and noticeability. And so to kind of bring that back into modernity a little bit, I've picked out some of the most effective campaign slogans from the last sort of 10 years or so. And you can see we've got kind of Obama's Yes We Can, we've got Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, the Take Back Control kind of EU Leave campaign, and then Build Back Better, which is something that's come up in the last year. And you can probably see what all of these have in common. They've used the power of three, which falls broadly under the simplicity part of the making the message singular. So our brains can really process 3 words really, really easily. It's a very common and effective comms technique. And you can see that for a lot of the slogans, they've gone for noticeability as well. So using just 2 color schemes and very bold colors like Black Lives Matter, or using something immediately recognizable like a flag. Again, very, very common techniques. However, when you start to, slogan's good, don't get me wrong, but it really matters if there is some substance behind the slogan. So I did a little bit of digging, and I picked on the Build Back Better campaign because that's the most recent. So I went and dived onto their website, thinking as if I was an ordinary person just coming onto this to try and understand their campaign better. And one of the first things that they say as one of their the things that they're demanding, kind of how to build back better, is to secure the health and needs of everyone in the UK now and into the future, which is to ensure access to food, healthcare, income, job security, good housing, clean and affordable energy and heat, public transport, clean air and green spaces for everyone, irrespective of employment or nationality. Now, that is what I describe as the opposite of specificity. That is, there's nothing you can disagree with per se, but it doesn't give me any sense of what they're actually going to do other than try and solve everything, which makes me not believe it, because it's too broad, it's too vague. And compare that with what the Leave campaign did. And I would argue that this is probably one of the reasons they were successful. They got much more specific. So when they said, we're going to do something about our taxes, they said, we're actually going to cut VAT on household energy bills. People go, oh, I get it, my gas bill will go down. When they said, we're going to do something about the borders, they're like, we're going to create a new points-based immigration system, which people can immediately understand what the implications of that will be to them and to the people immigrating to this country. And, whether or not you agree or disagree with any of this stuff, it was effective in its specificity. So that's a really, really important thing to bear in mind when you're devising your campaigns. But as a sort of general tip, thinking about how to make a message singular and unignorable, when you go out and about, start to take notice of the things that you notice, like the campaigns, the adverts, the messages that stand out to you, and make a note of why they stand out. It's quite useful to just take a notebook if you're waiting at a bus stop or queuing in line for something, to just think about how to make the message stand out. So, and the final story that I wanted to, I almost forgot about this one, which is a really good, has loads of great examples about how to make the message singular and unignorable. This comes from a great book called The Blueprint for Revolution by a guy called Sergej Popovic, who has actually led a real life revolution in his home country of Serbia. It's really, really inspiring. But he talks about a lot of the simple things that they did to make the campaign work in Serbia. They talk a lot about fun and playfulness and humor. And he talks about the fist symbol that becomes the logo of the revolution there, and how important the visibility of that logo was. It's simple and it was noticeable. And that helped people to believe that there was something happening, that there was something going on, that there was this kind of revolution happening behind the scenes, just the repetition of that image in places. But there's another really great story that revolves around cottage cheese. And what it is it's a story from Israel that comes from an ordinary shopkeeper who was getting frustrated with some of the economic inequalities that were happening, particularly around the housing market. But he realized that talking about the economy, talking about the housing market was quite dry, quite dull, and also quite big and overwhelming, and unlikely to get ordinary Israelis kind of trying to do anything about it. So he realized that he needed to focus on something that was a lot simpler and a lot more relatable to people. So he decided to focus on cottage cheese. Now, cottage cheese, for whatever reason, is a favoured dish in Israel, a favoured food. It's something that everybody seems to really love, which may or may not make sense to you. But and the price of cottage cheese had almost doubled in this period of time. So he decided to start talking, writing, blogging about the rise in the price of cottage cheese and how much of a travesty it was that it had almost doubled. And from there on, long story short, he started to gain traction. People started to go, hell yeah, like I think the price of cottage cheese should be a lot lower. And eventually this led to the biggest sort of producer of cottage cheese and other dairy products having to respond. And eventually they had to back down, and they reduced the price by, I think, about 3 shekels, which is fairly significant. And what's more, as a result of his campaign on cottage cheese, other groups started to apply the same sort of techniques to other areas. And eventually there were some moves made to tackle the housing market. That's a very, very brief version of what happened. So I'd really recommend reading the book. It has lots of great examples of how ordinary people can campaign on big issues. Okay, so that's making the message singular and unignorable. Before we go on to the second lesson, I would just like you to write in the chat, when you think of a famous pirate, who do you think of? Yep, can see a few for Long John Silver, Captain Jack Sparrow, and then of course a few for this guy, Blackbeard. I was just curious to know who people thought of as the most successful pirate, and unsurprisingly, the two that come up are also fictional pirates, because stories have far more power than real history most of the time, because Long John Silver is in fact an invention just in Treasure Island. He was never a real pirate. Blackbeard, however, is a real pirate. But the reason why people think of Blackbeard first when they think of piracy is because he was so good at weaponizing his story. Nobody was more dramatic than Blackbeard, because it's interesting when you look at the history, he was by no means the most successful pirate. He didn't have the most money, he didn't have the longest career. What he did do was make himself look really, really fierce, steal a really big ship, and set light to the ends of his beard to kind of create this ferocious reputation. He was all about the drama. In fact, there's no historical record of Blackbeard ever killing anyone. The point being, the story matters most. And what Blackbeard was really good at was making the medium the message. He used himself as a way to weaponize the story. And that's really about separating the story from the telling of it. How, when, where you tell your story is just as important as the story itself. I think that a good example of this in recent years is the Fridays for Future campaign. I mean, having young people, the literal future, carry the message of the climate crisis is incredibly powerful. And I've certainly heard in lots of different workshops of sort of middle-aged, older people are saying that the reason I'm paying attention to this is because my kids are telling me it's important. So that's been incredibly powerful sort of medium is the message. Another example I'd love to give you of this, which comes from my pirate crew, is a company called Tradecraft, who are original pirates. They campaigned for fair trade in the 1980s, essentially made it mainstream. But over time, Tradecraft have started to lose their sense of their mission and their edge. And so over the last few years, they've been really trying to distill down, what they're about. What does fair trade really mean today? It's become mainstream. It's become a little bit complex, a little bit sort of like bureaucratic. And a lot of people don't really know what fair trade means. And so the value that they want to get across is this idea of transparency. They think that having transparent supply chains is really, really important. But as you can probably, even as I'm saying it, I'm feeling a bit like, oh, this is a difficult kind of concept to talk about. Important as it might be, transparency is not, a bit dull. So what they actually said is, okay, we need to convey the message in a different way and use a different medium. So they produced a special edition transparency coffee with great pirate branding. And on the front of the packet, although you can't see it here, they have broken down the supply chain So you can see as a consumer exactly what goes to the farmers, what goes to the the transporters, the supermarket. So you can see exactly what fair trade is compared to, say, the price of regular coffee. So I thought that was quite a powerful use of it. Another example I love is this tram line that came from Manchester Council a few years ago, where they have decided to show the life expectancy in different parts of Greater Manchester on a tram map. And the tram map sits on the tram. So as you're actually traveling around the city, you can see the levels of deprivation in different areas compared to the life expectancy. And if you look to the far right, you'll see Rochdale Town Centre has a deprivation area of 1, which is like very, very low, so very high. You can see a key at the top here says 1 most deprived. So it's one of the most deprived areas in Greater Manchester, and the life expectancy for women is 74, 66 for men. If you compare that down here with East Didsbury, it's sort of in the middle, that has a deprivation level of 7 level, which is quite hot, means that it's quite a well-off area, and there's an almost 10-year gap or difference compared to Rochdale in terms of life expectancy. So I think that's really, again, a really, really powerful way to talk about health outcomes compared to deprivation in an engaging, accessible way as people are actually traveling through those areas. Okay, and the final lesson that I want to talk about when it comes to weaponizing the story is to take your story to the lion's den. This is one that most people are a little bit less keen to do. It's really about using the power of conflict to get attention. So I think that a lot of the time when we're composing a message, a story, we then think about taking it to the places who would be, or the people or the places that would be receptive to the message. We think we'll, test it out on the people who will like what we have to say. But it can actually work better the other way around. Pirates flew their flag right into the heart of the establishment, and it caused a stir, and that was the point. So you can actually get a lot more attention if you take your message directly to the people who are least likely to receive it well. To get attention, but on a slightly subtler level, it's a way to help you understand the strengths and weaknesses of your argument better. When you take it to the people who are not already convinced by what you do, you are likely to get more useful feedback and criticism, potentially. And of course, you have to use some judgment there. You don't want to take it to people who are, for whatever reason, absolutely opposed to what you're doing. But it can be a way of getting helpful feedback. A couple of examples here. This is a great campaign commissioned by Girl Guiding UK and run by the team at Liberty, a sort of youth marketing agency. And this video is called For the Girl, and it's all about everyday sexism. And look it up on YouTube, it's really, really good. But rather than launch the video in women's magazines or places that people would appreciate, already on board with the idea of everyday sexism, they decided to launch it on Lad Bible, the home of everyday sexism. And lo and behold, the video went viral because it was not the expected place to see a video like that. Another example is a bit more of an individual one. A guy who's in our pirate crew who I absolutely love, Matthew Cook. He is an HR manager at a creative agency in London, and concerned with the growing loneliness in the city, decided instead of writing a report about it, researching it, that he would try and tackle it at source. So he takes these signs onto the tube. For those of you who've been on the London Underground, it's pretty much the depths of the underworld where making eye contact is like, I don't know, same as lighting a cigarette or something. You are not well received. So Matthew takes these signs, and they're different kinds of signs with kind of feel-good messages on them, and he tries to make eye contact with people. And although he said, it was absolutely terrifying when he first started doing it, over time, it's been the most rewarding experience he's ever had, and people have started to join him too. And you can look it up on Instagram. It's called At a Beautiful Something. And there is, okay, so there's one final example I want to give you of this, which is my own. I do try and practice what I preach when it comes to Be More Pirate and weaponizing the story. So in our new book, How to Be More Pirate, I talk a little bit about what I call bad language. So the kind of language that often gets used in the kind of social innovation or charity sectors or in the civil services and even in academia. They're kind of quite smart sounding, vague and obstructive language that very often, just click onto the next slide. So yeah, I put this in our book. Yeah, kind of smart and obstructive language that I think gets in the way of social change. And in our book, I've given an example of this kind of language, which I think is really not helpful. And the sentence that I've chosen is, thinking systemically involves developing parsimonious but insightful ways of understanding the core dynamics of systems. That is a real sentence that I read to talk about social change. And I thought, what the hell does that mean? So the reason why this is taking your message to the lion's den is because I wanted to talk about this topic of language. But I deliberately used an example from the place that I used to work. Those words were spoken by Matthew Taylor, who's the chief executive of the RSA, which is my former employer. So I sort of semi-deliberately did that to cause, take my story into what I consider to be a little bit of my lion's den, a place that I think has some issues to address. And so I am deliberately, being provocative with them. Whether or not they care or haven't paid any attention is another matter. But it was a stab in that direction, let's say. Okay, so that's the first 3 lessons in weaponizing the story. There's going to be one more. But first of all, I'm going to put everybody into breakout rooms, and we're going to have a little bit of chat about some of the things that we've talked through.